Dear doctors, we are live. Dr. Kavya, you can start.
A very good evening to all. Today we will be having a discussion with our experts on gonadotropin's use in ART for PCOS. Next slide, please. Next slide. It's my proud privilege to introduce a very eminent person who is the founder president PCOS Society of India. Dr. Durusha, she is the director Gynae Board, the Center for Women's Health and Fertility, Mumbai. She is the founder trustee, Women's Empowerment Foundation, trustee and past president, MOX. She is the board member of ASPIRE, and she is the immediate past chairperson of the Special Interest Group on Reproductive Endocrinology and PCOS at ASPIRE. She is the International Advisor Special Interest Group of HRI. She is the chairperson of Indian Special Interest Group, American Society for Reproductive Medicine. She is the past president of ISAR FOXY IMS India. She is the past director of Digital Education, International Menopause Society, and she has given over 150 publications and chapters in international and national journals.
Hi, I'm Dr. Durusha, the founder president of the PCOS Society of India. The society is of multidisciplinary experts in the field of gynecology, dermatology, endocrinology, and all the allied specialists who look after PCOS women. We all are focused on creating awareness on PCOS, both amongst doctors and updating their knowledge. And we are also wanting to create the awareness amongst women at large for them to understand what they are having and what their problem is. In short, our organization is consisting of experts, both from India, and we also have members from outside the country. It's important for all of you to be with us and join us in our endeavor to upgrade our knowledge in this field and reach out to our patients so that they have a better quality of life in future. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. I'm very delighted to introduce the other active person in the PCOS Society who works at grassroots level and digitally through its YouTube channel in creating a public health awareness through a Divine Magic Foundation. She is Dr. Payal Bhargava. She is the consultant at the Pranada Hospital Sri Krishna Diagnostic Center. She is the co-founder and director on board at XPS Analytics Private Limited, member of Managing Committee, the PCOS Society of India, ART and Reproductive Medicine. She has done a fellowship in infertility at IMA Hyderabad and at Kiel, Germany. She is the life member of IMA, Menopause Society India, and the PCOS Society of India. I would request Dr. Payal Bhargava to proceed with the session in introducing the expert.
Thank you, Dr. Kavya, for the kind introduction. Good evening all, and welcome to this webinar series, bringing you the episode on which gonadotropin should we use in ART for PCOS. So let me introduce Dr. Neelam Ori. She is a fertility consultant and gynec laparoscopic surgeon from Varanasi. She is medical director, New Life Hospital and Advanced Fertility Center. She is past president, VOGS, secretary UP IAG 2021 and 2022, chairperson, ISAR, Uttar Pradesh. She is secretary, Varanasi Menopause Society, publications, various publications in national journals. She has various chapters written for books, special awards and recognition, recipient of Shan-e-Kashi and Kashi Ratna Awards, She has organized many national conferences. Welcome, ma'am. Next, please. The other expert we have today is Dr. Padma Rekha. She is Scientific Director, Sushruth Assisted Conception Clinic and Shreyas Hospital in Kolhapur, recognized by ICOG for fellowship course in IVF. She is the Managing Committee member of the PCOS Society of India, Clinical Research Fellowship in ART from University of Glasgow, 1995 and 1997. She is Editor-in-Chief of Journal of Human Reproductive Sciences, Reviewer for Human Fertility, Cambridge, Reproductive Biology and Endocrinology Journal of Assisted Reproduction and Genetics. She is Executive Vice Chairperson, Maharashtra Chapter of ISAR 2018-2020. She is Vice President and founder of Fertility Preservation Society of India 2020 to 2022. She has multiple publications in human reproduction, fertility, sterility, Journal of Human Reproductive Science. Welcome. Our next expert is Dr. Aishwarya Nupur. She is Fertility Consultant and Director, EVA IVF, Hyderabad. She has done MBBS, MS and Reproductive Medicine Fellowship from Mumbai. Next, please. So we have with us today Dr. Kavya Pradeep. She is Consultant and Head Department of Reproductive Medicine, NU Fertility, Shivanga, Karnataka. She has done her MBBS from JJMMC Devangiri, DGO from SDUMC Kolar. She has done Fellowship in Reproductive Medicine from Gunashala Hospitals and Dr. Patil's Fertility Hospitals, Bangalore. She is topper in University PG examination and has been awarded first for poster presentation at 5th International Annual Virtual Conference of PCOS Society of India, November 2020. She has been awarded first for paper presentation at FOXY ICOG NCD Virtual Conference, February 2021. She is guest speaker, resource faculty for various community health programs and academic events at medical colleges. She is life member, IFS, and patron member of PCOS Society of India. So she is a young expert we have with us today who is going to do a case presentation for us. Welcome, Kavya.
Thank you, Dr. Payal, for the warm welcome. Let us now start with the case presentation. Here is a brief history. Mrs. SK, age 30 years, she came to our OPD with the complaints of primary infertility since 5 years. Her menstrual cycles were always been irregular, suggesting chronic anovulation. She didn't have any other significant medical or surgical history. She gave us a history of significant weight gain of 11 kgs in the past 2 years. On routine clinical examination, she had hirsutism with the Ferryman-Galway score of 12. She had acne since 2 years, and she was very specific that she noticed all these changes once she started gaining weight. There was also a clinical evidence of insulin resistance, where she had acanthosis nigricans, and she had obesity with a waist circumference of 88 centimeter and BMI of 30 kg per meter square. On blood investigation, there was elevated free testosterone level suggesting hyperandrogenemia and an insulin resistance with an HOMA of 4.58. Her AMH was 3 with high basal LH of 10.2 with the decreased vitamin D levels. Our ultrasound showed a 14 ml and 16 ml volume in each ovaries with an AFC of 16 and 18 in each, suggesting polycystic morphology. We did a HSG on day 8 of her cycle, which showed bilateral patent tubes. Her thyroid, prolactin, and other pre-pregnancy tests were unremarkable. Coming to the brief history of the husband, Mr. KP, 32-year-old, he didn't have any significant medical or surgical history, no history of addiction and sexual dysfunction. His routine semen analysis showed normospermia. So the final diagnosis was Mrs. SK diagnosed with PCOS belonging to phenotype A category in view of chronic anovulation, hyperandrogenism, and polycystic morphology on ultrasound. So we made a plan of action for this patient, which included in the initial part her lifestyle modification and weight loss of at least 5% of the body weight prior to the treatment cycle. We gave her metformin for insulin resistance and 2 cycles of oral contraceptive pills, and also supplemented with vitamin D capsule. Patient was keen to try 2 to 3 cycles of ovulation induction with timed intercourse. So we proceeded with 3 cycles of ovulation induction with letrozole, followed by 1 cycle of IUI. In the first cycle of IUI, we started with low dose step-up protocol, starting with FSH of 75 international units from day 1 of a cycle to day 40, then stepped up to 100 international units for another 1 week. Cycle was closely monitored with the estrogen levels and also the ultrasound for the growth of the follicles. A dominant follicle was seen in the left ovary. When the dominant follicle reached 18 millimeter, we triggered her with HCG 5000 international units. And we scheduled for a single IUI after 40 hours of trigger. And in the very first cycle, the patient conceived and delivered a single male healthy baby weighing around 3 kg. Now I request, this was just a small gist of the history and our case, and I now request Madam to take forward the discussion so that we'll have a valuable inputs from our experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavya, for the wonderful case presentation. Now, gonadotropin therapy is suitable for improving fertility in PCOS patients under specialist care with close monitoring. Gonadotropin therapy provides better per cycle and cumulative pregnancy and live birth rates compared with the use of oral and anti-estrogens and or no therapy in an ovulatory woman with PCOS. And there's no evidence of teratogenicity. It is important to note that gonadotropin therapy requires daily injections and the need for intense monitoring with ultrasound, with a multiple risk of an increased cost of medication compared with oral agents. So today we have great minds with us to provide clarity on the use of gonadotropins, what, when, and why, and also how to. So let's start our discussion. What are the types and routes of gonadotropins? Dr. Neelam Hori, can you please answer this?
Hi, Payal.
Hi.
So it's really nice to see you all here. And Dr. Payal, the gonadotropins had been with us for more than 6 decades, as I know. And there are a lot of work and improvements have gone through these gonadotropins. And earlier we had HMG only, then came purified HMG, and which has more of HCG than LH. Then came purified FSH, where LH was removed. Then recombinants came, like recombinant FSH, LH, and recombinant HCG. Then there are polytropin alpha, polytropin delta, and long-acting FSH are there, like polytropin alpha. And as far as the routes of administration, we have subcutaneous route, intramuscular, and for GnRH sometimes IV route is also there. So this is about gonadotropins in short.
Thank you for updating us on that, ma'am. So the next question is for Dr. Padma. What are the patient selection criteria for gonadotropin, ma'am?
I mean, in the context of PCOS?
Yes, ma'am, in the context of PCOS.
Yeah, I think as Dr. Kavya has shown in the case they have managed, and as you have highlighted, gonadotropins are very effective but require very careful monitoring and titration of dose. So it is not used as a first line therapy. In the context of PCOS, its main indication is if the oral agents, that is, now it's well recognized that letrozole is the first line drug, and sometimes we may have used a combination of clomiphene and metformin. If the first line has failed, and very often, if in the indicated cases, if laparoscopic ovarian puncture has been performed and that hasn't yielded, if these two lines have not yielded in result in conception, then we would think of gonadotropins, either in the context of IUI or IVF. And I think ideal way to introduce gonadotropins would be in the context of IUI at least, not just gonadotropin therapy and timed intercourse, because I think there is plenty of evidence to say that if at least IUI is combined with gonadotropin therapy, the combination yields in a better pregnancy rate than just timed intercourse.
Yes, that's very true. So, Dr. Aishwarya, how do we prepare patient and counsel for gonadotropin? Because as it means an increased cost and also like daily injections. So how do we counsel a patient, and what is the preparation we need before starting gonadotropin therapy in the patient?
We advise gonadotropin therapy only when the patient has shown resistance or has failed to become pregnant with oral ovulagens. So in that case, we try for some good 3 to 6 cycles along with insulin sensitizers, and she's not ovulating at all, she's not growing follicles, we definitely tell them, okay, you're not growing at all, let us now switch over to gonadotropin. And if she's ovulating also, still she's not getting pregnant, then definitely studies have shown that adding gonadotropin and switching over to IUI will give better results. So this way we prepare them, and definitely cost-wise it is costlier than oral drugs. So nowadays I generally prefer the recombinant injections with pen or pre-filled syringes, especially in COVID times. We give them to take it at home. So the visits to the hospital is reduced, and they're also pretty happy. But yeah, timely monitoring is very important, because anytime they can blow up. So yes, if we explain things to them, I think they would understand, especially the city population, the urban population will definitely prefer subcutaneous injections, which they can take at home.
Okay, thank you for that. And so what are the protocols for PCOS patients, ma'am? Step up versus step down. Dr. Neelam, what do you think?
So there are step-up protocols which are mostly suited for PCOS patients, where we give small doses, start with small doses, and after 1 week or 14 days, we see it again, and then step up the dose, or and then other protocol is step down protocol. So in step up protocol, though the monofollicular development is more found, it is more prevalent, but it takes longer time duration, and sometimes patient has to wait for a longer period. And in that case, my preference is step down protocol, where I choose to give according to her age, BMI, and other parameters. I choose a starting dose, and then I do the monitoring on the days 6 or 7, and then I step down when there's a what we call as FSH threshold is found. Then I decrease the dose and then maintain on that. So step up and step down, both the protocols are there. And one is chronic step up protocol also. So most of the papers say that step up protocol is more suitable for PCOS, but I usually do step down protocol because it takes less time. Though multifollicular development is more common with step down, but it is more suited to our practice because it takes less time to have a mature follicle.
Okay. Dr. Padma, your opinion on this?
Yeah, I think how the patient has responded until, before we move on to gonadotropin also plays an important role. If she, as Dr. Aishwarya highlighted, if they have ovulated with oral agents but haven't conceived, they may respond differently to gonadotropins compared to somebody who is resistant to the first line of medications. So I think the safest option would be to consider step-up protocol in the context of PCOS. And that certainly, would be the safest and my preferred choice. Of course, counseling before starting the treatment plays a very important role. So the aspects I would highlight on would be the duration, maybe slightly longer. And in the bargain, we would more likely to achieve monofollicular ovulation and hence a reduced risk of multiple pregnancy or at times cycle cancellation if there is a higher number of follicles developing. So when we are talking about multifollicular development, it's not only the large follicles, 16 to 18 millimeters, but even follicles the size of 14 to 15 millimeters on the day of HCG can yield a fertilizable oocyte. And this is something very important for us to remember when we are deciding on the starting dose or increasing the dose. But however, if somebody is obese, hasn't responded to oral agents at the optimal dose, then at times we may have to start them on a slightly higher dose, bearing in mind that we may have to reduce the dose at a later date. So the first priority would be step-up protocol. And just, one more thing I wanted to add about the choice of gonadotropins.
Yeah.
We know now that, a highly purified HMG is also subcutaneously injectable, and people can be, taught about that. The point where recombinant FSH scores over any other preparation is that dose titration, minute dose titrations up to, whatever, 10, 12.5 units is absolutely easy with recombinant FSH compared to highly purified HMG. Otherwise, efficacy-wise, both are equivalent.
Okay. So usually what is the starting dose for a normal BMI patient for PCOS?
I mean, if we take what Dr. Kavya has presented, she did mention that they tried 3 cycles of letrozole and a cycle of IUI with oral agents, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm presuming that this patient responded to oral agents. I mean, I have to thank them, really congratulate them for convincing the patient to take injections for 21 days. But I would start with 75 units. And if necessary, depending on the response at the end of first week, I would decide on increasing the dose.
Yeah. So does the weight of the patient play a role? Because I think her patient was obese. She had like 88 waist circumference and other parameters. And the starting dose for her patient was 75. Yeah,
I think, one of the positive thing in her patient was her AMH was not very high. It was 3. So if somebody had a very high AMH, it's a tricky situation in that they may not respond to low doses, and on slight increment in the dose, they may just grow too many follicles. So I would start with 75 and increment with anywhere between 25 to 75 units based on their initial response.
Okay. Dr. Aishwarya, would you like to add anything on this?
It is little surprising, but I use 37.5 international units. I start with that because I'm little scared. I'm okay to continue for a period of 5 days more. But if BMI is within range, I generally start with 37.5. And as Padma ma'am said that, highly purified HMG is available in the liquid form. So I give that multi-dose vial to my patients home. We train them how to load 37.5. And for 5 days together at a stretch, they take it and they come back to us. So I'm comfortable using 37.5, start with that and take it for a week. I have rarely had to use 75 IU for the IUI. So until she's very obese.
Yeah, and she even had a high BMI. So this patient in discussion.
Yeah, so she used 75.
Otherwise, what you say is, really absolutely correct, that we have to start with a very low dose in the first cycle. And I think if the first cycle is not successful, then we know, at what dose we have achieved the stimulation. And in the subsequent cycles, I think we can start from the most effective dose we have seen in the previous cycle.
Okay, so moving on to our next question, what is the follow-up interval and monitoring for these patients? Do you have any problem with patients not coming back, like how Dr. Aishwarya said that, she gives a pen and tells her to use it at home? Does it happen with your patients? And how do you follow up these patients? And how do you monitor them?
Mostly we counsel them well that you have to get back to us, because we cannot take the risk. If you hyperstimulate, you will be in trouble, we'll be in trouble. So we counsel them well, we spend time with them very rarely. And if they are not able to come back, they generally inform us that I might come a day later. So we are okay with that. And if they are not in town after a week or 10 days, if they inform us well in advance, we tell them, don't go ahead with the cycle this month, we'll do it next month, but we need to do the monitoring. But follow-up is generally not a problem, they come back.
Okay. Dr. Neelam?
Yeah.
How do we manage the follow-up interval and monitoring of these patients, ma'am?
In step-up protocol, after 3 days, means on 4th day, we call them for the ultrasound. And with gonadotropin therapy, we have to ensure that patient is ready to come for follow-up. As Dr. Aishwarya was saying, if she's not able to come, then we don't go for the gonadotropin cycle, because for follow-up is really very important with gonadotropin. And in a step up protocol, it may take, you can follow up with in 7 days time, because you are starting with the lower dose. So after a longer period of time, you can go for ultrasound. But if it is step down protocol, so you have to monitor more closely, and an earlier call is required.
Okay. Dr. Padma, would you like to add anything on the follow-up interval and monitoring of the patients?
I agree with what Dr. Neelam has mentioned. The first scan is done between day 5 of stimulation to day 7, and then it is dependent on the response. So it may be alternate days, it may be daily, as we are heading towards achieving a follicle of 18 millimeters, 17 to 18 millimeters. So it is guided by the response of the patient.
Okay. So sometimes we have to cancel the cycle for these patients. What are the cycle cancellation criteria we must keep in mind for cycle cancellation?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the, it is the two extremes of responses. If we have done a step-up protocol, chronic step-up protocol, and there has been no response at 21 days, then obviously, we have to cancel that and revise the strategy. And more often, it is because of excessive response. With IUI, we have to remember that anything more than 3 follicles, and I would be worried beyond 2 follicles, the incidence of high order multiple pregnancy increases. So it is extremely important that either the patient has been previously counseled for conversion into IVF or for cycle cancellation. So if there is an increased, and the other extreme is if she's growing too many follicles and heading towards developing an unexpected scenario of hyperstimulation in the context of IUI. So that is when we would consider cancellation. But in IVF, of course, that situation is almost eliminated with the current strategies where we can give a GnRH agonist trigger, retrieve the oocytes, and avoid transfer of embryos in the fresh cycle, do segmentalization and transfer in a frozen embryo transfer cycle.
Okay. Dr. Aishwarya, your take on this cycle cancellation criteria?
So if she's been trying for the first time IUI, up to 2 or 3, I would go ahead with the IUI. But if she has been trying for long, married life is longer, and there is a male factor, I would try even with 4 or 5 follicles. Maybe I would do a serum E2, and I would try with 4 or 5 follicles also if she's been married for long and there is a severe male factor. But generally, 2 or 3, more than 3 follicles we would abandon the cycle and ask them to refrain from have abstinence also.
Dr. Neelam, would you like to add something?
It was very well explained by Dr. Padma that there may be 2 criteria for the cancellation. One is when you are not finding any response, even after 20 days with the step-up protocol, or if there are multifollicular development, more than 3 is not good. So if we have counseled her to convert it into IVF, then it is okay. Otherwise, more than 3 is not acceptable for me for IUI. Yeah, otherwise, multiple pregnancies, we find nowadays more multiple pregnancies with IUI rather than IVF. Then we go for a fetal reduction, and lot of mental and physical trauma is there. So better to avoid as far as possible multiple pregnancies.
Okay. So what are the risks of OHSS and its prevention strategies we need to take care of during IUI and IVF?
You're asking me?
Yes.
So OHSS is really may become very common during stimulation in PCOS, and we have to take care of many factors like what is her age, what is her BMI, then AMH, AFC, and other parameters like ovarian size, and then we have to choose very wisely what is the starting dose and what protocol we are using. Then what did you ask? That
risk of OHSS and its prevention strategies.
So we in PCOS we have always to have in our mind that OHSS can occur, and even I have seen rarely with patients with only with clomiphene also OHSS has occurred. So though not very severe, but mild to moderate OHSS has occurred. So we have to be very cautious always in stimulating them. And as I told you that all the parameters we have to keep in our mind, like if she is very thin also with multiple follicles in the ovaries, then she can very easily go in OHSS if we are not doing stimulation correctly. Then. And we know that the major culprit for OHSS is HCG injection. So if we are thinking that she is going into HSS, so at any cost we have to avoid giving HCG injection, and then only we can save with OHSS.
Dr. Padma, what's your take on this? Risk of OHS and its prevention. How
as
can we prevent
Dr. Neelam has mentioned, I think we need to sort of have an assessment prior to starting stimulation as to that individual's risk of developing severe OHSS. So, as she has, very rightly highlighted, a person, lean PCOS, somebody who has very high AMH, somebody, who has had history of hyper response previously. So these are the people who would, we have to watch very carefully. But of course, anybody with PCOS may develop unexpectedly OHSS. And during stimulation, the factors we need to pay attention at is her antral follicle count. If she has too many antral follicles, baseline antral follicles, and the starting dose, and also the type of trigger we are planning to give. These are all the factors which may influence the occurrence of OHSS. So prevention strategy, one of the most widely used prevention strategy is addition of metformin prior to stimulation. So there have been many publications indicating that introduction of metformin at the appropriate dose. We have to give at least minimal 1 gram per day, but preferably 1500 to 2500 milligram per day in divided doses before starting the stimulation, and carry on throughout stimulation to reduce the hyperstimulation. And in the context of IVF, addition of cabergoline from the time of retrieval also has been a widely practiced modality. So at every stage, we have to be vigilant. At every stage, we have to take active decisions. If we are starting stimulation, what should be the starting dose, and titrating the dose very carefully, monitoring very carefully throughout, deciding on what should be the trigger, whether it is low dose HCG, whether it should be HCG at all or not, and whether it should be GnRH agonist. And if we are using GnRH agonist, at that time, we also have to take a decision whether we are going to transfer any embryo in the fresh cycle or not. And based on that, think about the luteal phase also.
Okay. Dr. Aishwarya, yeah, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I would like to ask Padma ma'am, like I also use metformin as a prevention strategy prior to stimulation, but there are some papers telling that metformin during the period of stimulation may cause cell apoptosis. So
I think in the context of PCOS, when we have abundance of follicles, it's not going to, and practically you don't see something, the concern is that it's granulosa cell apoptosis and suboptimal oocytes. So it is obviously, in a clinical scenario, it's not possible to prove whether metformin is having that kind of an effect, but the overall evidence is in favor of metformin to prevent or to reduce the risk of OHSS or reduce high recruitment. Yes, I do agree that there are some experimental evidence available, but I think in a clinical scenario, it's not possible to prove or disprove that.
Dr. Neelam, do you use metformin for prevention of OHSS?
For PCOS, for me, it is always agonist trigger and freeze all policy. So I don't use any metformin or cabergoline because earlier when antagonist was not there and we were not doing this agonist trigger, I have seen many OHSS patients and very severe also, moderate one also. So I'm very much frightened of OHSS. So I keep away with all the experiments they give. So sorry for others giving metformin. For me, it is simply the stimulation triggered with agonist and freeze all, transfer in next cycle. That's it for PCOS.
And I just want to add one thing here. One of the concerns is that not everybody during IVF, I'm not talking about the IUI scenario, but during IVF, not everybody produces good quality embryos. There are always scenarios where the embryo quality would be suboptimal, or their response might be very optimal. They may end up, because of all the efforts we have put in, they may end up producing less number of follicles as desired. And hence, we may be in a situation where we can do a fresh transfer. So that is one of the reasons where, I do agree that in hyper-responders, the safest option would be to freeze all and with GnRH agonist protocol. But one of the concerns I have is, in a practical scenario, some of them do produce just about 10 to 12 follicles because of all the strategies implemented, and some of them do not produce very good quality embryos. So these are the scenarios where freezing such embryos and transferring at a later date just prolongs the cycle without actually contributing to any pregnancy. So that's why I just like to keep my options open in the IVF scenario.
So in spite of all the precautions, if OHSS still occurs, how do you manage? Dr. Neelam, How do you manage this? You said you've seen so many OHSs.
Actually, for the last maybe 8 years, I didn't have any OHSS in my clinic. So I have forgotten for now. But yes, we have to keep in mind the pathophysiology of OHSS, that the whole system of the body is dried up and all the fluid is in the third spaces, like in pleural effusion, ascites. So actually patient is dehydrated, but fluid is there, and there's a because of VEGF. So we have to monitor in that way and give her the fluids and uh, um, monitor her very closely, and we have to have a multidisciplinary approach in treating mainly the severe OHSS I'm talking about. For the mild OHSS, as Dr. Padma was saying, that cabergoline we give, and sometimes we also give antagonist injections. And so the treatment depends on the category of OHSS, mild, moderate, or severe. So I think Dr. Padma or Aishwarya will be able to detail on this more.
Okay. Dr. Aishwarya, what would you like to say on this?
Thankfully, I have started practicing in the era where my seniors had already done the job. So we have not seen much of OHSS. But yes, when I am doing pickup for IVF, I make it sure that I drain the intermediate and small follicles as well, as much as possible. And immediate post-op, we use starch, and rarely had to use antagonist. And we just manage with some letrose or cabergoline or some metformin. And we do encounter some mild OHSS cases, which is easily we can manage with outpatient basis. We just advise them fluid and high protein diet. And maybe when we were training with Dr. Durusha ma'am or Dr. Vaijayanti at KIMS, we had just seen one case of paracentesis, that's it. So thankfully, with these conservative management, we've been able to deal, and we've been able to maintain mostly an OHSS-free clinic. So like the paracentesis and oliguria, those stages we've not seen much, not at all rather.
Okay. And what is the dose of cabergoline that you give to these patients?
Okay,
Like
so
mild
we
OHSS?
give 0.5 mg vaginally for 8 days, because they complain of constipation a lot with cabergoline. So we've started giving vaginally for 8 days.
Okay. Dr. Padma?
Yeah, we start. I mean, as far as management of OHSS is concerned, in all those whom we believe are at high risk of OHSS at the time of retrieval, as Aishwarya said, make sure that we aspirate all the follicles to reduce the burden of granulosa cells and consequently reduce the peaking of estradiol, and then introduce cabergoline. We give it orally, and we've not had any major issue with that. We always advise them regarding active mobilization, good hydration, and high protein diet, and see them in the clinic maybe a couple of days later. Maintain an abdominal girth measurement as well, and also ask them to watch over their urine output, whether they subjectively feel any reduction, and if they do feel any distension of abdomen, reduced urine output, or if they do complain of breathlessness, they're asked to report immediately. And definitely, in the last few years, having to admit somebody or treat them actively or admit them in an ICU scenario, I think has become almost non-existent with all the recent strategies for prevention of OHSS. And of course, we need to, if it is suspected, we need to do we need to have a peripheral blood count to see the mainly the PCV, whether she's hemoconcentrated. So monitor the PCV, and then ultrasound to assess, ovarian enlargement and any fluid accumulation within the abdominal cavity, and also pleural effusion. And if they are heading towards moderate OHSs, then it is better that they're admitted and observed for urine output, monitor a strict intake output regime, and avoid giving excessive IV fluids, because we are only going to, because of increased vascular permeability, we are just going to pour more into the extravascular space rather than being retained within the intravascular space. It's also important that we look at the protein and albumin levels at that stage, have a good assessment of liver function and renal function also. And in selected scenarios, we may have to give intravenous albumin. And if, we have not actually given HCG, or if we have given HCG, we must know that all this scenario will reduce spontaneously by 7 days from the administration of HCG. So if we have not done embryo transfer, we know that with these initial management, things should, supportive management, things will settle down. But if she has received an embryo, if she has undergone an embryo transfer, then the scenario might be different, and it may extend into the second week, especially if she's getting pregnant. And these are the scenarios where they will go on, worsening in the severity, and may require all these invasive procedures and monitoring in ICU. But
So
thankfully, these situations have become almost non-existent. When I was training in UK, I have seen a patient dying of OHSs after I think 3 weeks in the hospital. So from that state, we have reached a very safe scenario, and we have to be vigilant nevertheless.
So do we admit this mild and moderate cases? Do we just call them for follow-up with the giving the instructions, or do we when do we admit them actually? When do we think that, we need to admit this patient? Because it may, from mild, it may go to moderate, and it may land up in severity.
I think mild is absolutely okay to, mild is somewhat expected in the scenario of IVF, even if they're not hyper responders. So we just need to be vigilant with them. We don't need to admit them. With moderate, it's a combination of their symptoms and the clinical signs, which should encourage us to decide whether we need to admit them or not. If she is tachycardic, if she complains of reduced urine output, if there is significant increase in the abdominal girth from the baseline measurement, so we will need to monitor her hematologically and biochemically. So it may become necessary to admit them for 24 to 48 hours to understand whether the situation is worsening or not. And definitely if it is severe, we will need to, or critical, we will need to admit them.
So for moderate cases, we need to admit them for around
it may become
1
necessary.
to 2 days.
If
for
frequent
observation.
Visits are not possible,
Yeah.
It may become necessary, because if their hematocrit is worsening, we may have to introduce heparin. So to have a better judgment, it may not be to any active for any active management, but to get an overall judgment of the situation, it may become necessary to admit them for 24 to 48 hours.
And is it more common in thin or obese patient? Is that relevant for developing OHSS?
Theoretically, it is said that lean PCOS women are more prone for severe OHSS. But I think in practical scenario, when we used to see them, we have seen them in all subgroups of women with PCOS.
Okay. Dr. Aishwarya, would you like to add anything on this?
Actually, the patients who come from periphery or far off, we give them these written sheets that when to report. The moment you develop breathlessness, urine output, you feel that it is decreasing, or you get severe pain, abdomen. So all these things, when to report, we chart it out and we hand it over to them, especially in their local language as well. And in the periphery, if they develop symptoms, and if they go to a local doctor, first we ask them to check the pulse. That is the basic thing. If she's developing tachycardia and hematocrit, and then we ask them to send immediately. So this is how we manage the patients who come from far off. And otherwise, I think mostly mild we can manage without admission. So we just, as ma'am said, we have to be vigilant that when she like shifts from mild to moderate and needs admission, we just have to remain vigilant. And yeah, abdominal girth we can measure immediately after the pickup to have a baseline idea. And later, if she develops symptoms, and later we can again measure and then compare the abdominal girth.
I mean, with COVID, one of the advantages that has happened is most of the people have pulse ox with them now.
Yeah.
You know, so they actually monitor very well and report. We get a report on a daily basis, and they're very prompt at noticing any change.
Yes. Yeah.
So now the other common thing in PCOS patients are large ovaries. So for these patients, what do we prefer, ovarian drilling or gonadotrophins? Dr. Neelam?
So, yeah. So, previously, maybe a few years back, we were doing a lot of ovarian drilling, but now we have stopped in a way of doing it. And gonadotropin is now a preferred choice. And only in few cases who are not responding to the treatment, who are not even responding to gonadotropins, who are very obese, ovaries are really very big, LH is very high, there was severe hyperandrogenemia, and there may be some very small reason even to do laparoscopy, like some problem in the tubes, then certainly we will go for laparoscopic ovarian drilling. Though laparoscopic ovarian drilling and gonadotropins, both are the second line treatment for PCOS. But nowadays, we have more started doing gonadotropin therapy first rather than laparoscopic ovarian drilling. So this is now the scenario. But in certain cases, LOD works really very well, which I have counted, like very high LH, very severe hyperandrogenism. So it helps a lot to the patient. So both are comparable, but as laparoscopy is an invasive procedure, and whatever you do means if you are doing some surgery over the ovaries, it may cause some adhesions. So it is better first try with gonadotropins, and if she is not responding, or in properly selected cases, a laparoscopic ovarian drilling is also recommended.
Okay. Dr. Aishwarya, you'd like to add?
I would say that in our practice, we don't do drilling just because she's not responding. If there is any other associated things, like we have to check the tubal patency or we are suspecting endometriosis, only then we go for laparoscopy, because there are many studies comparing laparoscopic ovarian drilling or gonadotropin as the second line. So the points in favor of laparoscopy would be, initially they thought that it would reduce the multiple pregnancy rate compared to the oral or injectable inducing agents, but it is not so. That has been proved now. It is not so. And earlier people thought that if we have done the drilling and we can leave the patient for 6 months, she might conceive. No, even after drilling, you need to put her on gonadotropins or oral drugs. So it doesn't help in any way. But I have seen many patients who come to us from the peripheries where surgeons have done drilling and a PCOS has been reduced to POI. So that is a very sad state. So, and I have seen a lot many. So I would request them not to touch. We will manage the high stroma and the high androgen with drugs. So I'm not in favor of drilling at all. I would rather manage her with a chronic low dose step-up protocol. And they generally respond. If we put them on metformin and insulin sensitizers for 2 to 3 months with lifestyle and diet, they generally respond. And if there is an associated indication, definitely laparoscopy, but otherwise not.
Okay.
Actually, laparoscopic ovarian drilling has done much of harm to the patient rather than any benefit, because many of the surgeons, they also do laparoscopy, and if they don't find anything inside, they just drill the ovaries to say that they have done something. So many times we have seen patients with low ovarian reserve after ovarian drilling done by some general surgeon, or so it should not be done recklessly and in very properly selected cases. And now, as I said, that its incidence has really gone down with the newer this HMG protocols and low HMG, low gonadotropin protocols. We can manage with that. And ovarian drilling, as Dr. Ashwara said, that if there's any other reason, like in HSG, tubes are not looking good, or small endometriosis, or we want to see inside some adhesions, etc., then we can do with, but with proper caution that we are not damaging the ovary in the rather than treating, we should not be damaging the ovaries.
Okay. Any one indication, ma'am, where we think that doing the drilling will do more good to the patient than going ahead with gonadotropin? Any one or two indications which are will be really beneficial for the patient that we go ahead with ovarian drilling for the patient?
If the ovaries are really very big and she is having very high LH and severe hyperandrogenism, then I can think of doing ovarian drilling.
Okay. And usually we do 4 punctures or more than that, ma'am?
Actually, 4 punctures and 4 millimeter,
Yeah.
something 40, what is recommended. But I would say that it should depend on the size of the ovaries and other hormonal parameters. So once I have seen that ovary was too big and it was in a very severely androgenic patient, and it was rotated, means twisted ovarian ovary it became, and it was necrosed, it had to be taken out. And after that, the load of that stroma and follicle was gone, and she conceived naturally after some time. So sometimes ovaries are so big, the only 4 punctures will not do. And sometimes, as I came with some study, it was saying that 2 punctures are not enough, 4 are good, 6 are more. So like this, but actually we have to see the size of the ovaries and then decide, because sometimes ovaries are too large to say, so it may require 8 to 10 punctures even. But yes, studies say that 4 punctures are enough.
Dr.
I think
Padma, would you like to add?
PCOS who are resistant to the initial oral stimulants are the ideal candidates, particularly if they are in need for laparoscopic assessment for other factors of infertility. And also, in our country where they travel from long distances and frequent visits to clinic may not be possible, and the person is relatively young, if the procedure is performed diligently, it may work very well for them. Definitely that before we consider ovarian puncture, the diagnosis of PCOS should not be in any doubt, and it has to be performed in the right setup by a qualified person. And
there are few papers saying that unilateral ovarian drilling can also be done.
Yeah.
You drill one ovary and leave the other ovary. So that is also one option.
Dr. Neelam, what is the role of clomiphene and gonadotropin together? Like to reduce the dose of gonadotropin and avoid hyperstimulation?
Yeah, it is. In our practice, we do it very routinely, very commonly, and it is mainly to reduce the dose of gonadotropin. So we take benefit of clomiphene as well as of gonadotropin, because as I perceive it, that like with clomiphene, there is thin endometrium or anti-estrogenic effect. So I give HMG also, so that it may counteract the effect of clomiphene on the endometrium, and some more estrogen may be there. So good endometrial development and some benefit to the follicle also. So for me, clomiphene and gonadotropin is a good combination, and mostly in IUIs I do with this protocol. Yes.
Dr. Padma, do you also use the combination of clomiphene and
I don't use clomiphene and gonadotropins together, but I do use letrozole and gonadotropins together.
Yeah.
And most recent systematic review also says that that combination is better as far as clinical pregnancy. It's all equivalent to gonadotropins alone. If you compare clomiphene, gonadotropin, letrozole, gonadotropin, and gonadotropin alone, combination of letrozole and gonadotropin is equivalent to gonadotropin alone as far as clinical pregnancy and live birth rates are concerned. So I usually use gonadotropins in combination with letrozole.
Yeah, in PCOS patient, I use letrozole plus gonadotropin, and in all other clomiphene plus gonadotropin.
And do you add metformin also, ma'am, with these two for PCOS patients?
Yes, sometimes it depends upon the patient's the physical characteristics. If she's obese and having the features of insulin resistance, then yes, I do combine with metformin. Otherwise, not.
Dr. Aishwarya, do you use the combination? Which combination, letrozole or clomiphene or metformin with gonadotropins?
Yeah, letrozole and gonadotropins I use. It definitely helps in cost reduction. If we use it for initial 5 days, at least we'll get 1 or 2 dominant. And then that can we can continue with gonadotropins. It helps in cost reduction. Definitely, initial 5 days are managed with oral drugs. And of late, I've combined both the insulin sensitizers, metformin and myoinositol, and it is helping. I feel it's helping. And there are 2 papers as well, which is saying to combine both. Even though in the outside India, myoinositols are not being used. But yes, I have tried both together. Yeah, and with especially if like the moment she's diagnosed as PCOS, whether we do insulin levels or not, she has some insulin resistance in her body for sure. And then she will have hyperandrogenemia, whether biochemically or clinically we find it or not. At least locally in the local hormonal milieu of ovary, androgens will be high. So using insulin sensitizers definitely helps get better quality oocytes and helps in ovulation as well.
Okay. So moving on to our next thing, HMG in frozen embryo transfer in a natural modified cycle. What do you have to say on this, Dr. Aishwarya?
So we generally do program cycle with the estradiol, but in some cases when we don't get a good endometrium and the patient has good reserve, so we don't start with just HMG. We start with oral drugs initially, and then as the follicle grows, we use 75 IU HMG if indicated, and then we give a trigger and then start progesterone, but not much. Mostly it's a program cycle with estradiol and progesterone.
Okay. Dr. Neelam?
Yeah, I haven't used much this protocol. Yes, there are studies which show that if you use mid-follicular HMG in this modified cycles, then results they found it was better. But mostly I don't use HMG. In one case only I use that, and mostly my cycles are with estradiol only. But yes, I have read papers, they have used HMG in the mid-follicular or late follicular phase, and they found good results with the live birth rates.
Okay. Dr. Padma, do you use the same?
Yeah, I mean, with in women with PCOS, by and large, it is programmed HRT cycle with estradiol, and that works well. Sometimes I may have to increment the dose of estradiol supplementation, and that has worked well. In all these years, maybe on 2 occasions I had to resort to adding HMG in the form of a modified cycle, and in that I had to do with letrozole with HMG. A small dose of HMG would be fine. So I do not think that should be propagated as the main line treatment for frozen embryo transfer. In those with regular cycles, I mean non-PCOS women, many units now do frozen embryo transfer in a natural cycle. But in women with PCOS with very irregular anovulatory cycles, programmed cycle with estradiol supplementation, starting most of the time with 6 milligrams, and then we may have to increment the dose.
Okay. Okay, that was really nice. So now the dose of gonadotrophins, what is the starting dose we should use for IUI versus IVF? Is it the same or more in IVF for the gonadotrophins?
Yeah, I mean, definitely for IUI, we should start with very low doses, depending on the patient profile, starting anywhere from 37.5 units to 50 or 75, based on the patient profile and previous response. For IVF, definitely we have more flexibility. We can start with still a lower dose than standard dose of 225 units. So we may start with 100 to 150 units. But what I repeatedly say is that if she has ever received any gonadotrophins in the past elsewhere, it's very important to look at the previous treatment history and see to what dose she has responded. But if it's the first time we are offering gonadotrophins in IVF, 100 to 150 units in an antagonist protocol would be the initial dose.
So we should always keep it in our mind that what is our aim of using gonadotropin in IUI and IVF.
Yeah.
In IUI, we want 2 to 3 follicles. So accordingly, we have to use smaller dose and smaller initial dosing. And in IVF, we want as much as follicle as possible. So accordingly, we choose the dose and the start. So it is always a higher dose for IVF and a smaller dose for 2 to 3 follicles, because many times we just add gonadotropin in IUI just to combat some subtle ovulation problems in the patient. She might be ovulating, but we want to add something and remove some subtle disovulation from her. So just we want to add for the endometrium or for the betterment of follicle, we want to add in IUI. But in IVF, if we start with a lower dose, a smaller dose, so we may not get the desired result. So there's a lot of difference in the dosing of gonadotropins in IUI and in IVF.
Okay. Dr. Aishwarya, would you like to say something on this?
Yeah, so as Padma ma'am told, previous response, we have to see definitely at what dose she has crossed her threshold. And BMI also plays an important role. For a very high BMI 30, we cannot start with 150. Otherwise, we would have lost many follicles to recruitment. So we better go start with 225. But otherwise, 150 would be enough. And I would also want to ask which gonadotropin you people are using. Is it a combination of FSH and HMG, or just FSH and then switch over to HMG after starting antagonist? Padma ma'am?
I am equally comfortable with both, recombinant FSH and highly purified HMG. See, I mean, at times, I don't use combination of the two in PCOS at all. And at times, choosing HMG, highly purified HMG, may work better in somebody who comes with a history of having had severe hyperstimulation, because this sort of with highly purified HMG, we expect to get less number of follicles, especially the small and intermediate ones, because of the effect of differential effect, how these two work. So there will be less recruitment with HMG highly purified. So and we need not be worried about what effect it's going to, whether this is going to add to the basal LH, because the amount of LH that gets reflected in circulation is minuscule when we inject any product containing LH activity. So it's not going to have any deleterious effect on the ovarian physiology. So if I'm using, a sort of multiples of 75 units. And if we are using just the usual 75 unit vials, and if the patient is coming to hospital for some reason for injections, then I would use highly purified HMG. But especially, those who are traveling from far away, who are going to self-inject, who are very comfortable with a pen, and we need to titrate the doses to small fractions, then I would be happier to use the recombinant FSH. Efficacy-wise, I think there is building up of evidence that both are equally effective in PCOS.
Yeah, ma'am, the Megaset trial said that rather with HMG, we are getting lesser number of oocytes.
Obviously,
but the blastocyst quality is better.
We will get less number of
but blastocyst quality is better, less of estradiol, less of progesterone, and the live birth rates are better. Blastocyst quality is better with HMG.
See, it also, in with that, probably there will be an increased liberty to do fresh cycle transfers. If that is contemplated, definitely it is not, it's as good a choice as recombinant FSH. And in certain scenario, the highly purified HMG has, valuable contribution towards safety of the cycle. It's basically because it leads to apoptosis of all the many of the small follicles. So recruitment is reduced. So there will be less oocytes, but better outcome, better embryo quality.
Dr. Neelam, what is the type of trigger we use for these patients on gonadotropins in PCOS?
If she is a candidate who can go in OHSS, then it should be agonist trigger. Otherwise, HCG is really a very nice trigger because it maintains corpus luteum and gives us good pregnancy rates. So nowadays, in our IVF setup, we are mostly using agonist trigger, and it is mostly freeze all cycles. Only maybe 1 or 2% are fresh cycles. So this is about the trigger. What else you want to ask or know?
What are the investigations needed on the day of trigger, ma'am? Besides doing an ultrasound, any other investigation we have to do on the day of trigger?
So on the day of trigger, we usually do estradiol level, and if we are planning for the fresh transfer, then we do progesterone. And at the same time, we also do complete blood count because we are going to do ovum pickup after a few hours. So CBC and estradiol usually we do, and if fresh transfer, then progesterone also.
Okay. Dr. Aishwarya, what is the type of trigger and investigation you would like to do for the patient on the day of trigger?
So on the day of trigger, many a times I do away without doing serum estradiol also. From ultrasound picture only we get an idea, okay, she would be crossing 3,000, 4,000 E2 levels. So anyways, there is no scope of giving HCG trigger. So just for documentation's sake, okay, we can do, but USG monitoring mostly is enough. Only if they don't respond at all, or we find that, okay, she would be going to the range of 7,000 or 8,000, maybe we would do, but otherwise not. And mostly it's agonist trigger.
Okay, so do you think in the next cycle doing these investigations might help in some way if the patient goes for another cycle?
Yeah, for documentation purpose, yeah, we can do on the day of trigger, we can do one serum estradiol. And if we are contemplating fresh transfer, we can do one P4 levels also.
Okay.
Sometimes serum estradiol may help, like you might be seeing good number of follicles, maybe 8 to 10 follicles, and you are not getting enough of estradiol in the test, then you can think of postponing HCG one day later, or you sometimes you can also think of that these follicles might be empty because there's no estradiol. Sometimes it helps, because I have seen that in ultrasound, I'm seeing many follicles, and I was
Yes.
surprised to see that estradiol was so low, means 600 or 500, like. So I thought only 2 or 3 follicles are mature, and rest of the follicles are really empty. So by that you can make your mind that you are not going to get enough oocytes after pickup.
But ma'am, it happens the other way around also at times when we have seen an estradiol levels of 5,000 or 6,000, and it doesn't correlate when we do the aspiration. So I don't know how
Yeah.
much we can rely these levels.
Yeah, because then this is secreted by the small follicles also. As you said that to prevent OHSS, you also aspirate very small follicles. So it is the accumulation of all the mature follicles and small follicles as well. So actually, then when there is excess of estradiol, so you will only know that there may be chance of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. It will not tell you about the number of mature follicles. But yes, if it is in the range of 2000 or 2500 or 1500, then you can count on that how many good follicles or mature oocytes you are expected to have. So
And
yes,
also-
as you said, it is for the purpose of documentation, but it gives a picture that how much you are going to have.
And also, if it's less than 3,000, we can think of giving dual trigger, which helps in oocyte maturity better with adding triptorelin or leuprolide.
If it is more than 3,000, I would
And HCG both.
go
Yeah.
for
No.
dual trigger because it will contain HCG, and again problem of OHSS will be there. So
See, I do LH in addition to estradiol and progesterone on the day of trigger. I think it sort of there is an area of this profound LH suppression, which is sort of, it comes up from time to time, and that may have some impact on the oocyte quality. So to look at that, I do all these 3 hormones. And as you both have very rightly mentioned, it's very difficult to decide on a lot of things just based on estradiol level. It may not match the follicular output despite having very high estradiol levels. And also, as I mentioned, I keep my options open for either fresh transfer or I'm comfortable deciding based on these parameters whether to do a fresh transfer or freeze-all. So the patients are counseled regarding both and also high probability of which. So we have not had any issues with that. And despite doing this, with the availability of GnRH agonist trigger, in the last few years, we have not had to admit a single patient for management of severe OHSS.
Ma'am, one more point here. Yeah,
I wanted to ask you, you were talking about dual trigger. So dual trigger you want to give only when you want to do a fresh transfer. So that, no? Yes.
When a PCOS has not responded in such a way that like maybe the estradiol levels are less than 2,500, then maybe we can go for a dual trigger and take her up for a fresh transfer.
Yeah.
Also, ma'am, one more point, which Padma ma'am said that you are doing a LH level on the day of trigger. Ma'am,
I do mid follicular and
I
do
ma'am, some of these patients, they are on OCPs and they would not reveal, ma'am. Maybe before we started IVF stimulation, they were on OCPs for a long time, 6 months, 8 months. So their basal LH would have gone down. And in some of these cases, ma'am, the agonist trigger doesn't work well. And that also is one of the reasons that why we don't get good number and the good quality of oocytes in some of these PCOS patients. Because in periphery, the physician would have kept her on long OCPs. And that is also one of the reasons. So to check LH, whether it's less than 0.5 or so, that also helps if we check LH on the day of trigger.
Yeah. And Aishwarya, when you mentioned about dual trigger in PCOS, do you give a standard HCG dose or 1500?
If at all, it would be 1500. And then if we are doing transfer after pickup also, on the day of pickup also, we can give 1500 and maybe 3 days later.
Yeah, but that
But
would
that
be
would
more
be-
more towards luteal support than
Yeah.
as a
That's
dual
my
trigger.
aspiration. Yes.
So which is more prefers, agonist or antagonist cycle for PCOS patients?
I think, my take is we need to have a very robust lab facility, for vitrification. That is the most important criteria to go ahead with GnRH agonist trigger and freeze all, segmentalize the cycle, and then do the transfer as a frozen embryo transfer. So that really, that whole scenario works very well. But
Dr.
as I
Neelam?
said, in selective cases, I'm open to doing a fresh cycle transfer. So there is plenty of evidence to say that we can do fresh cycle transfer safely. There are criteria as to how many, beyond how many follicles you would choose GnRH agonist, and within limits of 15. I mean, various units have quoted different criteria. Some of them have said retrieval of 15 oocytes, and some of them have said retrieval of 17 or 20 oocytes. But sticking to these criteria, we can be flexible in the scenario of PCOS also. But one has to be very clear. I mean, if the unit is not geared up to manage PCOS in the event that it happens, one has to then go for the safest option of GnRH agonist trigger, followed by freezing of all embryos. But if we are flexible, if we have all the manpower to monitor them very regularly, count all the follicles meticulously, and see how many big and how many intermediate follicles are there, and we are ready to take a call on that, in those very selected scenarios, we can consider HCG also.
Okay. Dr. Neelam, would you like to add something? Please unmute yourself.
So for me in PCOS, it is always antagonist cycle, and otherwise also we have shifted from agonist to antagonist long back, because it gives you a lot of flexibility. Cycles are short, and also the flexibility of using trigger as of HCG or agonist trigger. So as you asked, that agonist or antagonist, for me it is always antagonist cycle, and because it gives good results and flexibility, short cycles, less headache.
Okay. Dr.
Yeah.
Aishwarya, what do you prefer? Agonist or
Yeah,
antagonist?
It's definitely antagonist segmentation, and with the cryopreservation, it has reached a level where the thaw survival is very good. So we all are having a very good cryopreservation unit. So we can definitely go for segmentation, do the pickup, freeze all, and at a later we can do transfer.
Okay, so it was a very wonderful discussion. Let's take few questions from the audience. So one of the questions is, what say on IVF in HIV positive cases? It's a very interesting question. So have you come across any HIV positive patient?
I think to do HIV positive, we have to have permission from the government authority first, and second is, yes, we can do the IVF if the male partner means in discordant couple, we have to see if both are positive, or it is a discordant couple, then who is HIV positive. So if male is HIV positive, then transferring embryo in her might be risky. We have to counsel her, because baby may also become positive, and we have to take many precautions. And if husband is positive, then with semen wash, and again with counseling, because it may not be 100% can wear off the HIV from the semen. So as I know, with semen wash and with ICSI, we can proceed in discordant couple, and this is the thing. But we are not, I think we are not allowed to do HIV,
We can do.
yeah, without the permission of the government authority.
Okay. Do we counsel them for donors, ma'am? If HIV positive donor sperm or donor egg, can we use that for these patients? If one patient is like in one couple, it is HIV positive and the other is not. So do we counsel them for donor, like donor sperm?
If
the
female
male-
is negative, then we
Yeah.
can, and they are willing, then we can go ahead with donor sperm.
Okay.
I'm not, Dr. Neelam, aware of any special permission that is required, but we have to take all the precautions within the unit. The embryologist should be prepared to, they have to be prepared to deal with HIV positive gametes, patients' gametes, and we have to take all the precautions against infection. So the couple need to be counseled regarding this. As you very rightly said, if the husband is positive, if they are serodiscordant, ICSI would be the better option than IVF, even if there is no specific male factor problem. And the wife has to be extensively counseled that there is a small possibility of her and the offspring becoming HIV positive. But I think the evidence available is very reassuring that vertical transmission appears to be negligible with ICSI. And if the wife is positive, again, we have to be it has to be multidisciplinary management. We have to make sure that her viral load is less and the physicians managing her are okay with her going ahead with the treatment. And but there is some evidence that if the wife is HIV positive, there can be an increased chance of suboptimal oocyte and embryo quality. There are just 2 to 3 papers on that, and that we have seen in real life also. And most importantly, if we are going to vitrify any of their embryos, there has to be a separate system for that, and they cannot be placed along with others' embryos.
So thank you very much, all the experts. It was a very enlightening session and I got to learn a lot from Dr. Neelam, Dr. Padma and Dr. Aishwarya also.
You are being very kind, Dr. Payal.
Very nice. It was like we are talking together.
You conducted it beautifully.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I thank all our delegates participating for this webinar, all our experts and case presenter, Inca Life Sciences, a Sun Pharma division, the Omnicurus team, and the PCOS Society team. So this program is brought to you by the PCOS Society of India with support from our corporate partners, Inca Life Sciences, a Sun Pharma division. See you again on 4th September 2021 at 7 p.m. for the next episode of the wonderful W3 series on what is sleep apnea, why do we need to manage it, by the PCOS Society of India. Thank you very much. To become a member of the PCOS Society of India, log in now to www.pcosindia.org.
Thank you, Payal. Thank you, Dr. Padma, Kavya, Aishwarya.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was really nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Payal. Thank you, Dr. Neelam and Dr. Aishwarya and Dr. Kavya for that beautiful presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Kavya.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay,
everyone.
bye-bye.
Bye.